Howdy, colleagues. This is Cale Moffett. Wanted to share with you some of the ideas that have been floated around in the um, lawyer librarian community about fair use and the fair use doctrine in this time of COVID-19. What I'm going to be sharing with you comes from a document that's been published by them. I will link to it down below, and I will also be repeating some information, some ideas from a webinar that was put on by some of the authors of the document um, about fair use and the current health crisis. So let's get going. The primary argument of these lawyer librarians, most of whom specialize in intellectual property, is that the current public health crisis is a circumstance that calls for a very broad interpretation of the fair use doctrine. This is from the introduction to their statement. The fair use doctrine accommodates the flexibility required by our shared public health crisis, enabling society to function and progress while protecting human life and safety. Copyright was part of the first U.S. legal code and was set up to, quote, promote the progress of science and the useful arts. Copyright creates a set of protections that are limited because progress relies on the extension and development of others' work. Thus, fair use is part of the legal framework of copyright. Courts have consistently supported the use of copyrighted works for promotion of the public good and for education, though not every use is protected. Will Cross of North Carolina State University asserted that the suddenness of the COVID-19 outbreak constitutes a, quote, spontaneous and exigent circumstance, end quote, that favors arguments of fair use in online instruction because students both need access to learning materials, but in many cases cannot get to them for various reasons. Fair use cases are decided based on what are referred to as the four factors of fair use. Let me quickly summarize the arguments that favor a more open interpretation. The first factor is the nature of the use, with non-commercial use being favored over commercial uses. Historically, courts have been fairly friendly towards educational fair use claims, but this is not always guaranteed. The second factor is the nature of the work. Typically, courts look more favorably on uses of fact-based materials rather than creative works. But this factor has been less of a consideration in recent cases. So in the present circumstances, these experts agree that the type of work is not quite as critical as in other circumstances. The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the work used. It's important to recognize here that there are no rigid guidelines on the amount used. Many of us have accepted the suggestion that we should use no more than 10% of a work or one chapter or some variation on these ideas. These are actually based on non-binding recommendations called the Cantu Guidelines from the 80s that are largely dismissed by lawyers now. The key here is that the amount should be appropriate for the pedagogical purpose. An appropriate amount could be one chapter or four, 10 minutes of a film, or the whole thing. The fourth factor is the potential harm that the use has on the market of the work. Basically, courts look at how the use could negatively affect the creator's ability to gain from the work. Courts have paid a lot of attention to this factor, but the argument goes that the spontaneous and exigent circumstances of COVID-19 and the need to protect public health work in the favor of educators. Additionally, if the use of copyrighted materials is limited to currently enrolled students, acknowledged to be temporary, and copied materials are removed at the end of the term, then the market harm should be negligible. Now let's look at some recommended practices. The first is to find sources that are already available and covered by existing license agreements. Usually, this includes looking for sources or equivalents in library databases that are already available. There are actually a lot of ebooks and chapters in ebooks that can be used. Additionally, a number of publishers have temporarily opened up access to their catalogs. There's a list of some of these publications and these publishers, and I will make this link available. It can also be worth it to contact the publishers to see if they will make exceptions. In fact, one of our colleagues, Dr. Andrea Kunder, contacted Macmillan about getting her students access to a series of copyrighted online physics videos for a discounted price, and they are actually freely available for the time being. So contacting rights holders can be a really good idea. If you're interested in doing this, I or any of the other librarians can help you contact publishers' regional sales reps. Importantly, make sure to link to resources instead of posting files unless you are given permission otherwise. Linking is always a much more protected practice than posting files directly. Next, check to see if there are already openly licensed materials available, such as open educational resources, public domain materials, YouTube videos, TED Talks, etc. When necessary, materials may be scanned and shared with the following precautions. Materials should only be posted to current classes in Moodle. Sharing materials via email or personal websites would likely not be protected. Next, post appropriate amounts of material, what students actually need to learn. Post the minimum amount. But if an entire text is appropriate, then that use should be protected. Next, posting parts of a whole as students need them would be better than posting the entire whole all at once. Next, acknowledge that these scans are unusual and a reaction to the crisis situation. Also, remind students that the scans are for personal study only and should not be redistributed. I'm actually working on adapting language from a colleague on these points, and will make it available hopefully at the same time I make this video available. Next, take down the materials after the semester ends. Even though it may be still in Moodle, students may be able to get to it if you don't turn the class off. So best thing, just take it down. Additionally, use whatever technology you have access to, a home scanner, a phone, or tablet camera. If taking care of the scans with your own equipment, your own tools, will work just fine. Let's see. Posting copyrighted video, however, is much more complicated and should be pretty carefully done. Avoid it when you can, meaning avoid it being in copies when you can. Courts have been really protective of video materials, so we need to be very careful with that. Whenever possible, post links to content from licensed databases and other providers when necessary. Another one is post clips rather than full films whenever possible. Historically, courts have supported this practice, especially in educational use, but have not looked very well on full copies, especially copies that have sidestepped copyguard measures like regional encoding. Given the circumstances, fair use may be expanded, but we do need to be cautious. Lastly, we need to keep in mind that this expanded interpretation will only last as long as the health crisis. Many publishers that have opened access are doing so through May or June, which gives us a sense that they are sympathetic of expanded use of their materials, but are planning for only a limited amount of sympathy, so to speak. So the stance of the experts is that if we follow these principles and practices, we should be protected in sharing those materials with our students that they need to learn.